So we'll just introduce the folks who are at the head of the room here. So maybe we'll start over with you, Kel.
So welcome, I'm Carol Potacek from the University of Waterloo.
Hi, and I'm Tom Al from the University of Ottawa.
Matt Lindsay from the University of Saskatchewan.
Mark Lange with the Giant Mine Oversight Board, and I'll probably use the acronym GMOB for a while, but thank you for coming.
I'm David Blows from the University of Waterloo.
Alana Owen from University of Waterloo.
Nicholas Byer from the University of Alberta.
And maybe just a moment to acknowledge the other members of the other directors from GMOB in the room. Maybe you guys can just stand up briefly so we can see who you are. Wouldn't mind. We've got Ben in the back. Yeah, so these are all your GMOBers. There you go. All right. So I think now I can turn it to you. Is that right? Okay.
Thanks, Roxanne. So we're here today to share results on research towards a permanent solution to the arsenic trioxide dust that's stored below ground at Giant Mine. And I've got a little bit of background wanted to go through with you because I think we all would probably come to this session with a different understanding of the project. And I might even back up a little bit and explain what the heck GMOB is. So Giant Mine Oversight Board, myself and a few directors you met there, was set up as a result of the environmental assessment and the approval of the Giant Mine Reclamation Project. It was set up to act as a bit of a watchdog over the project. So we're an independent organization that sort of monitors what's going on site and gives advice to the project and the minister. That's one of the roles that the environmental assessment sort of gave us. The second one was to work towards a really, truly permanent and safe solution to deal with the arsenic trioxide below ground. So that's what we're here today to do, is to share some of the research that we've been working on, or these folks have been working on the last couple of years. The solution that I think we need to arrive at to deal with this arsenic trioxide has to be, very technically sound. That's why we're doing detailed research here. But it has to be acceptable to all of us who live here, live on the land, drink the water, harvest animals. So we're very excited to have the first really public session where we share some information. We hope to hear from you about what you think these ideas are like, and maybe suggestions on what you think we should be doing more of or differently. So the room is kind of set up strangely. There's, us up here and you guys are here, but really encourage interactions throughout the evening. Please do ask questions. Don't be embarrassed. So we're also, if you don't feel comfortable giving us some feedback here, we have an office downtown, GMOB. Please feel free to drop by or write us an email. So a little bit more context about the research here. So the research that you're going to hear about today is about testing ideas, viable ideas for stabilizing and making the arsenic trioxide safer. That's what science does. They test ideas and then test them again until, we see consistent results. At some point, once the idea that you're going to hear here are tested sufficiently, you might get to the stage where you're scaling up from a laboratory bench, and starting to test here in the field or much larger samples, and you start dealing with really the big questions like, how do we get this arsenic trioxide out of the ground, treat it? How do we then put it back? Where do we put it back? Do we put it back below ground, or do we put it back somewhere else on site? These questions about implementing the ideas, we don't have an answer for at this point. We're still working on testing what the best way to transform or deal with the molecule, the arsenic trioxide, would be. So at some point, we test our ideas, in the future, we'll be looking at scaling up or doing engineering. Once that's done and the sort of really solid idea emerges, you might end up then going to permitting. So you might have heard of environmental assessments and getting licenses, and even getting costing for what this new solution might be. So with this description, what we're talking about today is the ideas. We're really just testing the ideas at the very beginning. But I know the question probably is, okay, so this ideas, but when are we going to put wheels to this idea and implement the solution? I don't have a firm answer on that one, but there's certainly examples with Giant Mine, and I'll give you some more historical context that's kind of relevant. The Giant Mine site was taken over by the government of Canada in 1999. Very early on, in early 2000s, the project team spent 3 years really looking at in detail all the technical and scientific approaches that could be used to stabilize the arsenic trioxide. They looked at over 50 methods, and they came up with the frozen block approach. So that idea came out in 2000. 13 years later, the environmental assessment for that idea was completed by the Impact Review Board, and they agreed. After reviewing everything that had been done, the frozen block was the most stable approach at this point. And then the licenses, so after the environmental assessment, the licenses were issued for the project so they could finally do the work on site, and they were issued in 2020. So 20 years after the frozen block idea, finally there's enough wheels in place that the thermosiphon that will freeze the ground should be built in the next couple of years. So it takes a while to take an idea to actual production. Some more context, though. So the frozen block approach was found the most stable and was approved, but it was found to be temporary by the regulators. So it's a good solution for up to 100 years. That's where GMOB sort of took off, where we get to work on a solution that would be ultimately more stable. The other thing the regulators said is they said periodically, about every 20 years, the proponent has to review if there's a better solution out there. So built into remediating the site is the ability to incorporate some of the research ideas that we're testing here. The ideas that we're testing here and that we'll be presenting today, they're still very early stage. But at the same time, the results here are actually very promising. Our aim is to come up with a sufficient bundle of evidence for a permanent solution before the first 20-year review that's mandated. Which could happen really anytime, but it could also, be around in the 2040 sort of time period. So it's a while out, but we're pretty confident that we'll be able to recommend a more permanent solution. So that's some of the background and the history. We're going to be talking about the 7 research projects that the folks around the table here have been working on. You'll be able to follow along, obviously, but at the back of the room, we produced a pamphlet, and in this pamphlet, there's a summary of all the research projects, and I'll walk you through basically what we're going to cover today. It's on page 11 of this pamphlet for people online. There's a diagram that sort of summarizes those 7 projects. And I'll quickly walk you through one. The first one is really about looking at the dust and trying to understand its properties. So obviously we know there's arsenic trioxide, but there's also other elements and other chemicals present in there. And it's really important to know what you're dealing with before you look at how to stabilize it permanently. The next bunch of projects, about 4 projects, talk about taking the arsenic trioxide and stabilizing it. And there's sort of 2 different ways of stabilizing it. One is a physical encapsulation, if you will, so protecting the arsenic so it doesn't go and leach out into the environment. And the second approach is more of a chemical transformation. So on the physical side, you're going to hear about 2 projects. One is taking the dust and heating it up and turning it into a glass material. And then what you're going to hear about the project here is taking that glass and then testing it to see how stable it is, whether it releases arsenic over a period of time or whether it contains it very well. The second physical transformation you're going to hear about is taking the arsenic trioxide and mixing it with cement into a paste. The idea there is to encapsulate the arsenic trioxide, preventing it from being leached in the environment, and maybe using the cement for structural purpose, so below ground, keeping things stable. The next couple groups of transformations are more chemical in nature. So the first one is looking at an iron arsenic compound. It's a compound that's been used in the past to deal with arsenic. It's more stable. But this project is looking to see in the environment here in Yellowknife whether that product, iron arsenic, would be stable enough over the long term. And the next transformation is also another chemical transformation, but this one is looking at taking arsenic and combining it with sulfide to make another very stable compound that doesn't release arsenic easily. Again, here it's about coming up with the right recipe for it and seeing if it's stable enough in the environment here at Giant Mine. The next study is, I'm skipping a little bit here, that the arsenic sulfide requires arsenic trioxide to be, dissolved and then mixed with a sulfide. But you need sulfide somewhere. One option is to truck all this sulfide from the south. Another one, which this next project is going to look at, is creating the sulfide here locally with bacteria that is found here at Giant Mine site. The last project you'll hear about today is more about monitoring. So it's developing an isotope monitoring and analysis that would allow us to track the arsenic that may move through site, or that does move through the site, and identify where the arsenic may have come from. It could have come from the tailings pond, could have come from the arsenic below ground, or it could come from, if we choose a new technology to treat the arsenic, it could come from that source. So this monitoring technique would get into the detailed fingerprinting and be able to help us identify, as arsenic moves through the site, where it comes from, which then helps us deal with, how do you prevent that arsenic from moving around. So those are the 7 projects you're going to be hear about today, and let's get into them now.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I guess just before we do that, does anyone have any questions for Mark kind of about that big picture before we get into each of the individual projects? We'll check in with him again at the end. So if you have a question at that point, that's fine too. All right, so what we'll do then is we'll get started. So we'll be starting with the first project. Well, actually, the first 2 projects are the same team is dealing with them. So the first project is understanding the makeup of the arsenic dust itself, and that's Matt Lindsay, Associate Professor of the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan, working with Heather Jamieson, Professor Emerita at the Department of Geological Sciences and Geological Engineering at Queen's University. And so, and then they're also responsible for the second project you'll hear about, and I'll tell you about that in a second.
Okay, thanks everyone. So the first talk is going to look at how we're trying to better understand the makeup of the arsenic dust at Giant Mine, and just to acknowledge the many people that have contributed to this research at the University of Saskatchewan, Queen's University, and the University of Regina. So in the context of what Mark was just explaining, this project matters because the arsenic dust contains more than just arsenic, and the oxygen, as Mark described it, is as arsenic trioxide, so arsenic and oxygen, but there's more to it than that. There's small amounts of other chemical elements in the material, and those elements come from the ore body itself. So the ore body had a chemistry that changed over time, and when they processed that ore, the composition and the properties of the dust had changed over time as well. And these changes or these variations in the makeup of the dust can affect how it behaves in the environment and potentially how it might react if a chemical or physical transformation or encapsulation type process was used to try and stabilize it. So the first project here is to better understand that the material and its variability in chemistry and the physical properties. This is a high resolution microscope image of some of the dust sample that we were working with. And there's a scale bar on there that's 5 micrometers. And for context, that 5 micrometers scale bar on that image is about the thickness of spiderweb silk. So for context, you can imagine these are very, very small particles. So I mentioned the chemical composition. I'm just going to quickly show an image of a periodic table. Some of the boxes here, all of the boxes here are elements that can be found in the dust. We're going to focus principally in this talk, in this project, on arsenic and antimony. So you've heard a lot about arsenic. Antimony is another element that we find in the dust. And as you can see, they sit right next to each other. So arsenic's just above antimony in the periodic table. And that tells us that it has similar chemical properties and can maybe behave similarly in the environment or in this material. And so there's some relationships we're trying to understand between these two elements because it can affect, we think this is one of the factors that affects how it behaves in the environment, whether it dissolves into water or not. So the project had 2 main goals. The first one is to gain a clear picture of the dust's composition. That's the chemistry or the chemical composition, but also the physical properties of the dust. The second goal is to learn how this dust might dissolve in water, but considering different types of water that it might encounter on site. So different acidity, different amounts of salt, and also different temperature conditions are the main factors that we were looking at. And so if we can achieve the goals here, it'll help to inform the research that's ongoing and maybe future research into the stabilization and remediation of the dust at the giant mine. So there's 2 main steps that we're taking. The first one is to use different specialized techniques to try and understand the makeup of the dust. So how do all of these chemical elements fit together in the dust particles? And then the second one is to test how the dust behaves when it's placed in water with those different factors that I was talking about, the acidity, salinity, temperature, that sort of thing. And to look at different types of or different samples of dust from different areas of the mine as well. So we used samples that were collected in 2004 by CERNAC under the guidance of the Giant Mine Remediation Team. At the time, these were the only samples that were available, so this is what was used at the time, and these had been archived by a third-party organization. So specifically, we looked at 6 dust samples. These dust samples were from chambers that covered a range of the operational period of the mine, all the way from 1953 to about 1988. If we look at the image on the left here, this is a satellite image looking down on the mine. Here's Baker Creek running through here, the former mill site. And these little boxes or polygons or shapes are chambers that are underground. And the labels for those, just the ID labels for them are next to the chambers. And the samples that we looked at in this project to date were the ones that are highlighted in yellow. So you can see there's 6 of them. 5 of them up here and another one, C212, down here. If we look at just the photographs of some of these samples that we received to study, even looking at them, you might see that there's a slight difference in color. One of them is maybe there's big clumps that are sticking together. They're starting to see that even just looking at the material, there's some differences that are likely important. So for step 1, what have we learned so far? So we've learned that the dust samples are mostly made up of arsenic and oxygen crystals. This isn't surprising to us. This is what we expected. We're not expecting huge variations in what's there. It's actually the small changes that are likely going to matter a lot for how the material behaves. So the arsenic content of these 6 samples ranged from about 62% to 73% arsenic. If it was pure arsenic trioxide, it would be 76%, and the remainder would be oxygen. So this tells us that we don't have pure arsenic trioxide particles, so there are other things there. So the other elements that we see are things like iron and sulfur and antimony, and the contents of those elements range from about 1 to 5%, and these are by weight. Interestingly, we see that when the arsenic content goes down, we often see a corresponding increase in the antimony content. So that's telling us that there might be something going on with those 2 elements. So using some different techniques, including one that's available at what's called the Canadian Light Source Synchrotron. This is a large-scale national research facility that's in Saskatoon that we're able to access for free to study these samples. We did find that it looks like some of the antimony, this other element that sits near arsenic on the periodic table, can replace arsenic in these crystals, and that's really important because it may influence or alter how the material behaves, and so the data that we have shows that this is happening. And then the next step is to understand, well, what does that mean if we try and dissolve this material in different types of water? So the first goal, the project's been achieved. We've published the work in scientific journals. Now they are available publicly, so anyone can download them and look at them. There's no charges, and all the data is available too. Now, the reason that I'm pointing out that it's published is it means it's been vetted by scientific community, so the data quality has been assessed by others. So step 2, what have we learned so far? It turns out that temperature has the biggest influence on how much of the dust dissolves. We found that about 30% more dust will dissolve in a given volume of water. So say you have a liter of water, you can dissolve 30% more dust in that 1 liter of water at 25 degrees than you could at 5 degrees. So temperature is really a really important factor. There were some differences between experiments where we were trying to dissolve it in, say, acidic water or water with more salt in it, but those differences were much less than the differences in temperature. Interestingly, there's a little bit of a relationship with the composition too. So we did end up finding that if there's more antimony and a little less arsenic, less of the dust will also dissolve. So the composition does matter, and this is important for stabilization, for various stabilization approaches that might be used. And we actually see that after we dissolve solids, there's some left behind, and the material that's left behind does tend to have a higher arsenic content than the starting material, telling us that the portion that's dissolving tends to be the more arsenic-rich portion of the material, of the dust. So what progress have we made? Well, we've done all of the experiments and we've done all of our analyses, and we're working on getting the results published and made available that way. And that's it for project 1. I just wanted to quickly, there's a couple of logos here I just want to quickly point out. So TerraNet, this is a network of researchers that's called Toward Environmentally Responsible Resource Extraction. It's led out of the University of Waterloo, and the researchers here are part of that network. And NSERC, which is the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council for Canada, they fund most university-based scientific research and engineering research in Canada. So we've as researchers, we've been able to access additional funds and over and above Giant Mines funding to support some of this research. And the Ontario government has also supported the Waterloo research team as well. And that's it for the project 1.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And I know it's a lot to cover and not a lot of time, so thank you, Matt. So we do have a few minutes. We can take maybe 2 or 3 questions, depending on how complex they are. Are there any questions? Okay.
Just a clarification, you were referring to types of water, but you were referring that the temperature of water is really a critical variable. So what are you meaning when you say types of water?
Yeah, great question. That wasn't immediately clear. So we're looking at water that has basically different chemistry. And then you're right, the variable that, or the factor that seemed to have the biggest influence was actually temperature, not specifically the chemistry of the water.
Any other questions? Okay. So what I'll do is I'll ask you, I know you, so the second presentation is also, but I'll let you introduce what it is because I'm not anywhere near my paper, so I will misrepresent it.
Everyone can look at the back of their head.
Okay, so I'm giving the second project talk as well. So this project is looking at a different material that currently exists on the Giant Mine site, but also is a common approach to treating arsenic-rich mine waters. And so we're trying to look at the stability of iron arsenic solids that are generated during the treatment of arsenic-rich or arsenic-bearing mine waters. This technique is used broadly in the mining industry, but it has been used at Giant Mine, and it is a possible solution for dealing with the arsenic dust and arsenic in water from the dust. So again, just acknowledging that all of this research is done by teams of people. This isn't certainly not just me. And again, the team here is from University of Saskatchewan, Queen's University, and University of Regina. So in the context of the Giant Mine research projects that you're seeing tonight, why does this matter? So currently, to maintain a water level that's below the level of the arsenic dust chambers underground at Giant Mine, they have to pump water. That water comes to surface. It does have arsenic in it, and it needs to be treated before it can be discharged. And the common way to do that is to alter the chemistry of the water and form solids that take up the arsenic with iron usually. And so this photograph here is not from Giant Mine. I didn't have a good photograph of the Giant Mine site, but it's a similar type of iron arsenic solid at a former mine in Spain. And so maybe you've seen these orange solids around mine sites before, maybe not, but they're very effective at taking up arsenic out of the water into the solids. The question is whether these are going to be stable and whether they're stable in relation to some of the other possible longer term or permanent solutions that might be considered through this and other projects. And the question is, are these arsenic iron solids stable enough that the arsenic will remain with the solids, or could the arsenic leave the solids and end up in the water? And that's what we want to understand here. So the main goal is to learn about this long-term stability of these iron arsenic solids, and we're specifically going to look at different environmental factors, again, things like temperature, but whether or not there's oxygen present, things like that could lead to the arsenic moving from the solids to the water that's in contact with those solids. And so achieving this goal will help us to understand whether the arsenic stays with those solids or ends up in the water after mine remediation. So this project also has two main steps. The first step is to produce these solids in the lab, so that we can examine them in experiments under different conditions where we can control the conditions and better understand what's going on in these experiments. And then the second one is specifically testing these different iron arsenic solids under different conditions to see how well they can retain arsenic with the solid instead of it leaving and ending up in the water. One of the techniques, again, that we use is at the Canadian Light Source Synchrotron in Saskatoon, and we've other groups you'll see have been using this technique too, because it allows us to really look at a really high detail at what's going on with these solids. So what specific solids are we using in this research? There's 3 main iron arsenic solids, and they're commonly produced in mines. They're produced at Giant Mine and many other mines around the world. The 2 that are most common that we would see at Giant Mine are called ferrihydrite and ferric arsenate. These are just the names of 2 specific minerals with specific chemistry. And there's a third one called scorodite. Not as much of this at Giant Mine, but it's relevant for comparison. It was produced at Con Mine, and it's produced broadly in the mining industry. And again, it's a possible solid product that could be produced to try and stabilize the arsenic. And we are analyzing samples from Giant Mine so that we can compare our experimental work to the real world scenario at Giant Mine. So what have we learned so far? 2 of those 3 solids are fairly straightforward for us to prepare in the lab, and the third one's not. It took a little more effort and some trial and error to figure out how to make that happen. In the end, we've been able to produce all 3 of them, and the way we analyze them has told us that we are producing the same material that we see at many mine sites. This is an image of one of our students who was working on this as part of one of their university research projects. So importantly, the samples that we were able to obtain from the Giant Mine do contain 2 of these three iron arsenic solids or minerals that we're considering. On the right here, there's a little bit of data. There we go. So on the right here, this is some data. So we take these solids and we hit them with X-rays, and the X-rays will essentially reflect or bounce off of the solids. And the way that they do that tells us what is in those solids. And so this data is just showing that 2 of those 3 minerals, or those iron arsenic solids that we're considering in our research, are indeed found at the Giant Mine. And there's a lot of arsenic in them, so not surprisingly. So in terms of progress, this project is still ongoing. The first part of the project, the first step of the project, has been completed, and we're now ramping up the experiments to test how these different solids behave, or whether they're stable when they're placed in water with different conditions. Again, how acidic the water is, the temperature of the water, and how much salt is in the water. The research will continue through into 2024, and we should be wrapping it up in next year sometime. And that's it for Project 2.
I was wondering, how is it currently being produced? It's in the water treatment plant, right? That are currently being produced? It's when the water goes through. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, are there any questions about these? Are kind of fundamental pieces that inform some of the other work that you'll hear about as the evening progresses. But any questions at all? Okay. And do we have any participants online, Ben, or it's only researchers? We're good? Okay. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Are those compounds just produced like naturally, or do you do something to make them? Like, I mean, obviously you made them in the lab, but when you're on site, they just happen?
It's a great question. So they can just form naturally if you've got the right conditions, but the solids that we're talking about are being produced through active treatment of the water that's being pumped. So the treatment plant for that water will, I believe, add some iron and change the acidity of the water so that the conditions lead to the formation of these solids. But they do form naturally, or they form in the environment without the chemical approach that's taken in water treatment too.
Mm-hmm. I have a question about the treatment and precipitating the dust into more solid compounds. And I know that if you add sulfuric acid to the arsenic compounds, that it will not only create the sulfides, the solid, stable sulfides, but it'll also create a hydrogen gas that you can capture, and which is harmless to the environment. So is your experiment including some hydrosulfuric acid treatment to the dust? And
So this specific project does not, but you're going to hear two projects that are looking at trying to react the arsenic with sulfide to form those solids that are very insoluble, that won't dissolve much. Yes.
right.
Yeah. So you'll hear about it soon.
More.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm jumping the gun.
No, that's not a problem.
We know you'll be interested at least, so that's good. Thanks. Other questions? Oh, I have one in the back, and I say, oh, is it okay? And then I will definitely take yours after, Kevin.
The iron sulfides, arsenic sulfide, or sorry, yeah. They're being produced at the mine site each summer as the water is being treated. Are they stored underground? Are they stored on surface? What's the process there?
So I can tell you that they are stored on surface. I don't know if there's any stored underground. They're certainly stored on surface. The treated water is discharged into a settling pond, and so the solids will settle out, and the water is the water. I can't comment on where the water goes. But the solids are retained in a settling pond on the surface of the mine site. I don't know if any has been sent underground or not.
Okay, I'm going to go to the back of the, did you have a follow-up? Okay.
What kind of risk is there that those solids will break down? Are they stable?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's the second step of the project that we're still working on. These solids are fairly stable when you have oxygen and water, like you normally would at the surface of Earth. However, often remediation involves burying these materials, and that can change how much oxygen is present. It can change some of the chemistry of the water that interacts with those solids, and that's what we're trying to figure out, is if those changes might be a problem for the stability.
Thank you. We're going to go to a question to the back of the room, and then we'll probably need to move to the next presentation. And we will hopefully still have time kind of as we proceed towards the end to kind of come back to presentations. But
yeah, thanks. So how does this, what you're studying, differ from what the Con mine was using in the autoclave, where they were producing scorodite, which was as I understand it, a form of iron arsenic compound? Thanks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Scorodite is also an iron arsenic compound. It has slightly different properties, but it contains arsenic and iron. And you're right that Con produced it in their autoclave. Giant, the solids we're looking at Giant were not produced with an autoclave, so we don't have that heating. And so the solids are different. They have different properties, similar chemistry though. So iron and arsenic still. And we're looking at all three because all three are relevant in the context of arsenic stabilization at any mine site, but particularly Giant. And it is possible that, if we're looking at some of the other techniques or approaches that you'll hear about shortly, it's important to sort of compare that to what's the standard in the industry, what's commonly done already, because if what's commonly done is as good as you're going to get, we need to know that. I can tell you it's not going to be the case, but we kind of need that baseline of here's what's normally done, here's what's happened at Giant, and here's how it would compare to these other approaches that are being assessed.
okay. So I was just checking because I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. I do have time for one more question, I think, before we move on. So I didn't want to. So is that okay? Is there a follow up to that, or is that okay? That's good. Okay, I'll just come over here. We'll take one more question.
I want to go from underground to the surface, and because we're talking a lot about mine tailings. And I know there's a dust problem off of that tailings pond. And I'm wondering if there's any thought to perhaps treating a surface layer of the tailings pond to solidify that as part of the reclamation project.
So
that makes sense.
It's a really important question. It's not something that this team has been looking at, but Heather Jameson, I know, has worked on dust from the tailings. And I don't know, Heather, do you have any follow-up for that one?
Thanks, Roxanne. Yes, it is a problem sometime. I understand it's usually in the spring and May sometimes that the tailings dust blows towards Delo or other places. So we collected a few years ago, I had a graduate student that collected near surface tailings and then sieved them so they were really, really fine particles like the windblown dust, and looked to see what kinds of arsenic were in them, because some kinds are more troublesome, more toxic actually than others. And she found out that about half of it was arsenopyrite and half of it was what's sometimes called calcine, iron oxide with a bit of arsenic in it. So we found out what they were made of. But you're right, a cover, which is going to be in place hopefully quite soon, will make a big difference and keep those events from happening.
Is there any research done on the type of car?
There is.
Nope.
But that's not, and I can't speak to that, but the project people know that.
Yeah. I maybe I should have clarified this at the beginning. I know people probably have a lot of questions about the project itself and how the remediation is proceeding, but I want to be really clear. The researchers here have been tasked with doing research in terms of a solution for the arsenic trioxide dust, which is currently going to be frozen in place. And so I wouldn't want to ask them to speak to project kind of management of the site and the tailings ponds. One, because it's really not their area of responsibility, but also because we won't get to the research about how to take care of the arsenic trioxide dust. Yeah, so I would definitely, yeah, you can ask David. I'm sure he has some views on that. There's also, I know the project team also has sometimes opportunities. They have the annual forum and that kind of thing. So thanks for your indulgence there. So what I'm going to do now is move us on to project number 3. And so that is, excuse me. So now we're getting into more of the what to do with, what are some of the ideas around either transforming physically or chemically the arsenic trioxide so that it is less problematic. So the project number 3 is turning arsenic dust into a mineral that will not dissolve in water, which is obviously one of the major challenges around the dust and why it's dangerous. So Tom Al, Professor, Department of Earth and Environment Sciences at the University of Ottawa, is going to take us through his research there. Or his team's research.
Thanks. So I'll first acknowledge again a team effort, postdocs and graduate students and collaborators from certainly, within this team. So this project really is, Mark talked to this a little bit. He said there's several projects where we're aiming to transform the arsenic from the form that's presently dominant in the dust to something that is more stable. And by stable, we really mean doesn't dissolve in water. So you can think of that in many ways. There's an analogy. You're familiar with iron pipe. Sorry. Iron pipe rusts, corrodes, doesn't last too long in the environment, but it's iron. There's another form of iron that you're also very familiar with, and that's stainless steel. It's iron with some chromium, and it's very stable. So what we're getting at here is that arsenic has many different forms and they all have different properties. And so what I'm going to talk to you today is about taking the arsenic oxide that's in the dust, transforming it to something that really should be much more stable. And so I'll proceed. So just to quickly contrast the types of arsenic that I'm talking about. So you're familiar with the arsenic trioxide or arsenic oxide, and that is the dominant form by far of arsenic in this dust. There is also iron arsenate, and Matt talked about some iron arsenic oxygen compounds, scordite being one of them. But by far, arsenic oxide. So on the left, this photograph is some of the dust from Giant. It's from one of the older stopes filled in the 1950s and 60s. You see it's not clear white, and arsenic oxide is white. It's really quite brown, rusty brown, because there's a lot of iron in this material too. And then on the right side, there is the arsenic sulfide, and that's the target of our interest here. We are aiming to find a way to transform the arsenic into this arsenic sulfide, which is much more stable. And so arsenic oxide, I think that they're pumping the mine. They have to keep the water level low. The water level can't come up and interact with the arsenic in the chambers, because arsenic oxide is very soluble. So if that water came in contact, the groundwater rose, then that arsenic oxide would dissolve and it would go into the water, and wherever the water goes, the arsenic follows. So that's what we're trying to avoid here, of course. So the idea is to transform it to this arsenic sulfide, which is that yellow compound. And if you add water to that, then the water remains quite clean. So that's the goal. Just transform it from one form to another, and the properties change radically. And so the arsenic, just to step back a little bit, the arsenic in the dust that came from underground, right? We all know that it was arsenopyrite first. It went through the roaster. It was oxidized, formed arsenic oxide, and that's the problem. So it was brought up and made into that unstable form by the mining process. So our goal here with this project is to say, okay, well, let's put it back underground, but put it back underground in a different form, back in a sulfide form, which it originated as. And if you put it back underground in the sulfide form, then it should be stable for a very long time. So that's the idea. And I've got a little animation here. And sorry, I'm just going to move something here. So this is a cross-section of the mine, and probably you've all seen this sort of thing before. The horizontal lines are drifts, the vertical lines are shafts. You see the head frames, ground surface. The brown stippled region is stopes where the mine was, where the ore was mined out. So those are partly open caverns. Maybe some are collapsed, maybe some are filled with paste backfill. But fundamentally, they were open caverns and that created that way by the mining. Up here, the brown, that's the chambers that contain the arsenic. And so what we're talking about here is we would need to remove the material from those chambers, bring it up to some surface facility where the transformation from the oxide to the sulfide could occur. And I'm animating that, and you remove the material, bring it up to some processing facility, and then pump that stuff deep down underground into a very stable environment for this material. So that's the ultimate goal, but we're a long ways from that, right? So we're studying at the lab scale how this can be done. So just to look at our current project goals, we need to design an effective process to turn that arsenic oxide into the sulfide. And by effective, what I really mean is we want to minimize chemical usage, for example. So we need to get this material into solution, this arsenic oxide. And we do not want to be trucking up truckloads of acid or base and all sorts of chemicals that are ultimately going to become wastewater. So we want to use water. That's what we want to use. There's water right beside the mine, and so we're trying to design a method that allows us to use water to get this arsenic oxide into solution so that we can transform the oxide to a sulfide. And the process, as Mark mentioned previously, it must be scalable. It must be able to adapt it to a scale of an industrial process, which this would ultimately be to do the transformation. So how can this be done? I have here just a little flow chart, and this is showing us essentially how we're thinking about it. So we've got the arsenic dust, we've got water. We need to bring those two together and heat them, because just like when you put sugar in water, if you heat the water, that sugar dissolves a lot faster. So it's the same thing here. That arsenic oxide does dissolve in water, but it dissolves a whole lot quicker and easier at high temperature. So we're working at temperatures from 140 to 220 degrees to get this stuff into solution. That's the first step. And then, as Matt mentioned, there is a residue. There's other materials in this dust. There's quartz and feldspar. There's minerals that were in the ore that are still in it. There's going to be a residue after we dissolve the arsenic oxide. So we need to separate that residue, and that's what centrifuge is for. We separate the residue, and then we look at the residue very carefully, because we have to know that we've been able to dissolve all the arsenic oxide. So we use X-ray techniques to look at it, and we have basically it's a yes, no. Did we succeed? Is all the arsenic oxide gone or not? Maybe there's some arsenic oxide in the residue. So we have to look at the residue carefully. And there's a solution that's created. That solution is very concentrated in arsenic because we've dissolved the arsenic oxide. So that's the solution that we then can imagine treating with hydrogen sulfide to form this arsenic sulfide. And that hydrogen sulfide can come from various sources. The next talk, Carol will be talking about one of those. But that's step 2, adding the sulfide to get the formation of the arsenic sulfide. And I can talk about all the steps that are involved in this, but I thought it was easier. I'll just show you a little video that walks you through the process that we follow in the lab, and that should hopefully give you the visuals to help you think about it. So this is Jillian Abraham. She's a master's student that works with me at the University of Ottawa, and here she's preparing to do the dissolution of some of that arsenic dust. So she's going to weigh out a fixed amount of the dust into that vial, and we very carefully keep track of the weights and measures for the arsenic in the water, and that allows us to build a recipe, really, that gives us the right ratios of dust to water so that we can effectively dissolve the material, but not use too much water and not leave any arsenic oxide behind. So that's what Jill's doing. It says RO water on the label. It's just reverse osmosis. This is very clean water. That's all it is. So she's going to put a fixed amount of water in the vial, and then she's going to put the vial in a microwave. So we use a microwave because it's very fast heating, and it's a special lab microwave that accommodates these vials, but it does nothing different than your microwave at home. It just heats the water. And so we'll show you that in a minute, but first it comes out okay, now here we go. This is suspension. Goes in the microwave. And here you're going to see the red line in the middle ramping up very quickly. That's the temperature. Goes up to 200 degrees, flattens out for a minute, and then drops down. I've sped this up a lot. Okay, so comes out. Still a suspension, but it doesn't seem to have as much in it. She's going to decant the water into a vial. And now we have to separate the solid from the liquid. So it's going to go into this centrifuge. To do that, again, takes about 10 minutes in the centrifuge, so we just sped that up. You take it out, and you can see the solids packed down to the bottom of the vial. And so we'll take it from there, and this flask is just, there's water in there, same water. We're just diluting this water from the vial into the water that was already in the flask. And then we start bubbling some hydrogen sulfide gas through. Okay, so you can see it turns yellow very quickly. That yellow is the arsenic sulfide. And so it's a very quick reaction, and it forms this sulfide, which is a very stable material. And I'm told I have to move along. So, okay, you go into a time warp up here. So this is just a slide that shows this X-ray diffraction technique that we use to determine that we've dissolved all the arsenic oxide. So just pay attention to this red circled region. This peak up here with the blue line here, that is a diagnostic peak for arsenic oxide. So if you follow down these, the blue, the green, the orange, right through to the red, they're different temperatures. So the residues measured, or residues from extractions at different temperatures. You see the one at the bottom, the blue one, that's from a 140-degree extraction. There's still a peak there. And that tells us there's still arsenic oxide in the residue. We got a lot of it out, but we didn't get it all out. But if you go up at the same position, at 160, 180, and so on, that peak's gone. So that means that the arsenic oxide has all dissolved. So we've been able to dissolve all of the arsenic oxide in water, no chemicals at all. Okay, so then this slide just quickly says how much of the total arsenic we've gotten out. So these are three, B212, 233, and 235 are three different chambers where the arsenic's stored. Properties are different for these materials. And what we see is that for 212, we get around 97% of all the arsenic from that dust out in the water. The remaining about 3% is a different form of arsenic. It's not arsenic oxide. It's an iron arsenic oxide. Okay, so it's the material that Matt was talking about. And for B233, we get less, 85%. That's because there's a lot of iron in this sample, and there's a lot of iron arsenic oxide left behind. But we're getting all the arsenic trioxide. And 99% roughly for the other one. Okay, so the arsenic oxide comes out, the arsenic iron oxide does not. And there's good reasons for that. Okay, so just to get to the progress, the key point here, arsenic oxide dissolves in water. And that's really good news, because we don't have to bring all those chemicals to the table to get this stuff into solution. Work continues because we have to test the method on a greater variety of dust samples. These chambers don't contain all the same dust. It's quite variable from place to place. We need to test this method on many of them. We need to study the reaction of the dissolved arsenic to form the sulfide. You saw it. It's in the video. It happens, but there's a lot of details that we have to look into still. We need to study more the chemistry and mineralogy of the residue that's left behind. And we want to test the stability of that solid residue in simulated mine water. Perhaps we're going to perhaps in the future they would say, well, let's put that residue deep in the mine as well. We need to know that that's a good idea and that it could be stable. And finally, we just want to minimize the water requirements. We know we can do this, but we want to do it most effectively by using the least amount of water possible. And progress, we're about 70% there. And I'm sorry, Roxanne, I'm way over time. Okay, so there we go. I'll take questions if anybody has any.
All right, so I'm just going to check in, just because I'm just going to see if there's other questions in the room at all, and I'll come to you. It's good? Okay.
I'm just curious as to why you use H2S rather than H2SO4 as the solvent for the dust.
Well,
or the precipitate to precipitate.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. So SO4 is sulfate. It's a more oxidized. It's really the most oxidized form of sulfur. We need a reduced form of sulfur, which is sulfide, to form this insoluble mineral. So we don't want to form a sulfate because the sulfates are generally more soluble.
Oh,
yeah.
Which is, the H2S coming out of your reaction, sour gas.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, that's right. But it forms the sulfide mineral that we're after.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? And I have time for one more after this, so let me see if you will have a question.
Yeah, thanks. So the hydrogen sulfide is not good stuff. Where would we get it from, and there's lots of risks associated with its use, I would think. So I know that that's probably not what you're looking at, but if this was to be done at some sort of a larger scale, we would probably require a lot of hydrogen sulfide, which is really nasty stuff. So anyways, just trying to think ahead.
Absolutely true. No, there's no question. Given a choice of reagents, you wouldn't choose H2S. That's for sure. But you need to make a sulfide if this was a chosen route to follow. H2S is used in industry on a regular basis. It is an industrial chemical and it's handled safely and so on. So, you could take a path and say, we need to bring in sulfur and make H2S and accomplish this task. But the next talk that Carol's going to gives some alternative as well. Okay, so, but these are questions that have to be dealt with, and it'll be more than us weighing those answers.
Thank you. I have time for one more. I should have given you some tickets.
I don't think you need a microphone.
Oh yes, but that helps me keep track of what's going on.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just went blank. Just give me a second.
It was the pressure.
I'll ask it later.
It'll come back to you.
Sure.
Oh, it's coagulant and flocculant as the agent to precipitate out the ions. Has that been looked into rather than H2S?
Oh, well, a coagulant or flocculant would be used to collect and pull the arsenic sulfide into a form that's more easily settled.
Yeah.
And so those are questions that we're going to look into to some degree. There's literature, there's knowledge about that already, but we will look into it to some extent.
Yeah. Well, I know because I did this method in Rankin Inlet.
Oh, good. Okay. Sure.
Okay, and just to keep us moving along, thank you so much. I'm going to move to the next topic. So this is project number 4. So it's Carol, and so Tom has paved the way there for you, Carol Tachek, pardon me. She's a professor at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, University of Waterloo, and the project is using bacteria from the environment to produce an essential ingredient to producing essential ingredients for stabilizing the arsenic. So go ahead, Carol.
So yes, we'll be looking at the role of bacteria, that how we might be able to produce some hydrogen sulfide in a manner that would be using local materials. So what are we trying to achieve? Even closer.
Where you want. I'm just this for a bit because I just think in the back they might have a little more trouble.
Okay. We aim to provide a tool to help stabilize the arsenic dust at Giant Mine, and by using environmentally sourced bacteria and locally available food sources. And so again, this fits into the project most directly with what Tom just talked about, where we're forming arsenic sulfide minerals, and we're saying, can local bacteria help produce essential sulfides for this transformation? So it feeds right into this project. So first of all, what are bacteria? They're microscopic single-celled organisms. They're found virtually everywhere, including soil, water, skin. Bacteria play a large role in the environment. They regulate many of the natural cycles, but they also can live in extreme environments like glaciers, the deep sea, and the highly contaminated Giant Mine. So how can bacteria help the Giant Mine? The bacterial community at Giant has adapted to the arsenic contamination over time. So they've been exposed to the arsenic for a long time and they've been adjusting. These bacteria naturally produce chemicals that combine with dissolved arsenic to create arsenic trapping minerals, namely arsenic sulfide. Just what Tom was talking about previously. Some of these bacteria are able to eat and breathe the arsenic and use it for energy. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So one group of the bacteria that we're looking at are sulfate-reducing bacteria. They play a large role in the environment. They're anaerobic, meaning they cannot breathe oxygen. These bacteria breathe sulfate instead of oxygen. So that's important, is that then they're active below the water table. So in the deeper part of the mine where there's standing water, they can survive. The high concentrations of sulfate are found in the water at Giant Mine. There's many analyses of the water chemistry. The deep mine waters have sulfate, and that's why these bacteria can thrive in that setting. The sulfate is naturally converted to sulfide, which has that characteristic rotten egg smell, but we also know that it is a toxic gas at high concentrations. But the production of the sulfide is necessary for the formation of these insoluble or low soluble arsenic sulfide minerals. And so you need it, but we have to produce it in a way that's safe and manageable. The second group of bacteria are called dissimilatory arsenic reducing bacteria. It's a long name, but those are the bacteria that especially thrive or survive, depends on how you look at it, where there's high concentrations of arsenic. Over time, they have developed different ways to survive and thrive. They actually can either breathe oxidized forms of arsenic, but they also can transform it. We say they eat it, they'll ingest it, and then send it out of the cells to detoxify the system. They're similar to these sulfate-reducing bacteria, that they also are anaerobic, meaning they can thrive and survive in the absence of oxygen. So again, below the water. So they help with the formation of the arsenic trapping minerals by converting arsenic into a more stable form. So we conducted, I can maybe go back a bit. Our project is just started recently. And so we started with field work this last summer at the Giant Mine. And so for that field work, we went out to different sites around the Giant Mine site, looking for places where these bacteria might be growing and thriving. And these included places we saw environments of standing water, a high organic carbon content. We'll get to that. And collected those samples and took them back to the lab. These places are the North Tailings Pond, the Baker Pond, just outside of the Baker Pond. There's a creek here and some standing water outside of the Northwest Tailings containment area, and also in this foreshore area along the Great Slave Lake. So those are the sampling places. And the photographs here show those 4 locations. So these sulfur-reducing bacteria will often inhabit these wetland areas that have both sulfate and organic material. They have to have both. And that organic material is naturally occurring at the site in different places. We collected the sediment from those 4 wetland areas, but we also looked for areas we thought would have high arsenic, and we went back and analyzed those samples to make sure they had high arsenic. And that was so that we could hopefully find these arsenic-reducing bacteria. So we're looking for 2 types of bacteria. So back in the lab, we looked at the genetic composition of those microbes. Similar how we're looking at coronavirus versus flu, we can distinguish all the different types of bacteria using techniques. And then we are now trying to grow those bacteria up and find the ones that are most effective at reducing sulfate and producing hydrogen sulfide in the presence of very high concentrations of arsenic. Arsenic can be toxic to sulfate-reducing bacteria, so we want to find ones that have learned to develop a nice resistance to arsenic. We also are using locally sourced Yellowknife food waste. So one example we have is spent brewer's grain from the Northwest Territory Brewing Company. We are looking into compost at the landfill, different types of waste material, waste organic matter, so that we can take that off and it'd be a low cost food source. So far, the project is very new, but we have found these sulfate-reducing bacteria in all 4 wetland areas that we sampled. We have up to 21% of our reeds in the analysis in this one area just where there's very, very high arsenic and sulfate, and then lower amounts elsewhere. So some locations have more sulfur-reducing bacteria, but we also found some that are very cold tolerant. And now we're looking at how much arsenic they can be exposed to with and still thrive. And so we also think there are these arsenic-reducing bacteria, but that will take some more work to identify their presence. So what we're going to be doing next is to conduct a whole series of lab experiments to find the optimal food sources, to assess how much arsenic they can manage to thrive, how much they can grow within and not die. And also then we're looking at, can we use the bacteria to dissolve some of the arsenic dust itself? And so we're setting up a little reactor systems and lots of tests to find out which bacteria and what are the optimum conditions. So far, the progress is only 10%, but we think it's important to show what we're trying to do and that we might be able to get a sulfide source that can be generated locally. I might step back here on this diagram. There's industrial processes that use this technique. What we're doing is taking the mine water itself, has a lot of sulfate and arsenic in it, and we want to make sure that what would normally be used in industry will work for the giant mine, and so that part is well known, and we have other experience using a different organic matter and different food sources. So what we hope to achieve is that we'll learn more about the local microbiology and how bacteria play a role in arsenic remediation. Perhaps we can provide a long-term bioremediation solution that uses your locally sourced material. And I also would like to acknowledge that this is a team effort for this work.
Thank you, Carol. So I wonder, just kind of opening up to questions, I think so this is the kind of conclusion of the chemical transformation. Is that correct, Mark? These are all the chemical transformation pieces. So they kind of fit together, right? Because they're kind of all related to turning the arsenic trioxide dust into a more stable form, which means it would not be at risk of diluting into the water and getting into our waterways and our groundwater. So this is kind of those pieces, and they kind of fit together. Oh, you can't hear me? Oh, thank you for the signal. So this is kind of the projects that are dealing with chemically changing the arsenic trioxide dust so it is less risky. So it's not at risk of diluting into the water. The next ones are going to move on to are more about changing the physical kind of state of the arsenic trioxide. So just wanted to kind of say that. And so if there are questions about these, any of the chemical transformation stuff you've heard, it would be time to ask.
If I don't see you, just raise your hand.
I think this question is probably for Mark. It was very interesting to hear about the bacteria. I just wonder if anything on fungi has been considered by GMOB.
Yeah, or not at this stage in our work. We have looked at fungi at other mine sites, and they do have a very active role, but so far not with this project.
Yeah, Mark with GMOB, and we have, as you might know, we also are open to receiving other research ideas. We have a separate process that looks at reviewing the merit of a research project before we fund it and stuff, and we haven't received any requests for funding looking at fungi. Although a couple of months ago, we got called from a business out in Texas who specializes in using both bacteria and fungi to clean up anything from mine sites to radioactive sites. And they claim they've got a whole bank of organisms that can work to help clean up. So we welcome a proposal from them. They haven't arrived yet, but could be in the future.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, I'll hand you the microphone. You do as you will.
Not a question, just a comment. Are you working with the brew pub and coming up with a new type of beer that is going? So it'll be a win-win for everyone.
Yeah.
Like arsenic smash.
We actually have used some of the brew material from other breweries from other mine sites, and so it's pretty effective material. But yes, it does a
Pretty effective drink as
From my
well.
point of view, we'd be happy to work with the brewery.
And maybe just Mark, did you want to take a moment to just explain that this is kind of an ongoing that like what does that look like as a accepting other project kind of while we just kind of before we move to the next project, like the other proposals, other ideas?
Yeah, sure. I can give you a bit more context on the research sort of writ large. When GMOB was formed, and we redid all of the studies that the proponent did in 2017. So we looked at all 50 plus options for treatment. Some of them sort of bubbled up as more promising, and we wanted to actively stimulate research in some of those areas that looked promising. So the people before me, other board members, got together to try and started interviewing folks like who could we work together with a group to study some of these questions. And this is where we met Terranet and all the folks here. And so the directed research that we're involved in is everyone here at this table. But there's another way to do research too, like I suggested, which is we've got an open process. Basically, anybody who has any ideas, and there has been some interesting ideas coming out from the woodwork. So our job is sort of filtering some of those ideas, but we're also helped by another group of scientists different from these folks, an independent sort of advisory group that help us review these proposals that come in for their merit. Like, does the proposal make sense? So over the years in that process, Ben, have we ended up approving projects? I know there's one in the hopper right now that we're reviewing. That is also looking at a chemical transformation, but doing it at a room temperature. So we're looking at funding that one. A couple months ago, 2 projects. Oh, okay, that's promising.
Okay. I just thought it was just to kind of say that this is not it necessarily. Okay. All right, so move on to project 5 and 6 are both projects that have to do with this physical change, physical transformation. So there is, so project 5 is Alana, and she'll introduce herself, and it's testing the long-term safety of arsenic-containing glass. And Anna's a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Waterloo. Go ahead, Alana.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. So for today, I'm just going to update the virtual-fly arsenic glass project. Can virtual-fly dust be a potential solution for stabilizing the arsenic dust on giant mine? So for this project, what we are looking is to safety test glass that is prepared from arsenic dust under different conditions. So the first question is, what is vitrification? Vitrification simply means convert material into glass or substance that is similar to glass. Dundee Sustainable Technologies has a glass lock technique that can combine glass forming reagents, bonder solutions, which are kind of like materials or chemicals, hold stuff together to form a cohesive structure. And then with industrial waste that containing arsenic, put into high temperature furnace and produce glass materials. For this study, Dundee prepared a few samples, used the dust from the giant mine. Dundee has completed their industrial demonstration in 2018, and now Dundee is finalizing details to make a full-scale plant in West Africa. So back in 2021, we received this three glass, G5, G10, and G15. The number refers to the target final arsenic concentration within the glass. To achieve this final concentration, Dundee play around with their formulations, and then they had to use different content of the dust to make those glass. And here are a few examples about the glass we got. So they're very consistent. Their meter diameter is about one centimeter. And from picture looking, they're all look same. So the main objective for this study is to test the long-term safety of arsenic-containing glass. And the project has been separated into 3 steps. So the first step is to look at the physical and chemical properties. And then the second step is to put the glass into different type of liquids and try to examine how much arsenic can release from the dust. So basically, we're trying to use different type of solutions and try to make maybe the worst scenario ever, see how much arsenic is coming from the glass. And then we are doing and then let it rotate for a day. And then for the last one is put glass with strong acid in a pressurized vessel and put it into a microwave and heat it up and to see how much arsenic released from the glass. So the last step is kind of possibly, well, the most worst condition that may ever happen in real conditions. And what we found is after we put the glass into water or slightly saline solutions, the arsenic concentration were below the current limit for the wastewater treatment plant. And then we also look at concentrations from the most extreme conditions. The arsenic concentration from here was at 2,300 milligram per liter. If you look at the number, it seems very big, but that number is still 75% lower than the maximum concentration observed in underground mine water. So these experiments tells us that vitrification of dust into glass can potentially decrease its solubility. So next question we have is where did glass be stored eventually? For example, if they're stored underground, and what would happen if they contact with flowing groundwater all the time, or like what would happen if they're being sitting somewhere above the ground and then in contact with flowing water such as lake water or rainwater. To answer these questions, we conducted a column experiment. So what we do is we put the glass in the columns and then pump liquid through the columns, try to mimic constantly flowing through the glass. And now there are 9 columns still flowing in the lab, and then 3 different solutions were used. So the first one is kind of like water that kind of has a similar concentration to local water and giant mine, but with no arsenic and iron. And then this set of experiments was conducted under minimal oxygen condition, try to mimic what's happening underground. And then the second solution we used was that Great Slave Lake water. And then the third one is the local rainwater. So this water, we kind of calculate a 5-year like a composition from rainwater measurements at the Yellowknife. What we found here, this is a complex chart. I will try to explain so it'll be easier to understand. So when we conduct the column experiments, we monitor concentration of arsenic over time. So here at the bottom, the pore volumes is actually the scale of time. And approximately 1 pore volume equals to about 2 days. And then there's a red dashed line on the top that represents the current limit for the wastewater treatment plant. And then there's a dot dash black line on the bottom that represents the filter limit for the new water treatment plant. And there are a few symbols. So the blue symbols represents for the concentration from column that are being flushed with Great Slave Lake water. And then the green triangles are for the concentrations for the columns that are flushed with the local groundwater. And then the yellow squares are for the concentrations from columns that are flushed with the rainwater. So one of the message we can get here is that the stability of the glass depends on the formulations as well as environmental settings. So for example, G10, which is perform better compared to G5 and the G15, and all the observed concentrations were below the current limit. And if you compare the concentration to the concentration at the wastewater treatment plant, they are very similar. So which means just adding the dust into into furnace and then make into glass can actually produce similar results with all the water treatment system. But then the other thing we need to keep in mind is when the glass is stored underground, there might be potential of release more arsenic over time. So what we found from this project is that the vitrification process can stabilize arsenic dust and giant mine. However, it needs to be careful to determine where the glass will be finally stored. Some simple experiments, just put the glass in the water for a few days or maybe a few hours. Even the results of those experiments were kind of low, but it doesn't mean that it does not have long-term risks. And then conducting experiments that more represent to what's happening on real conditions may better help to determine long-term risks. In terms of timeline, so the first two part of this project, the experimental work have complete, and then I'm getting into the stage to put the results into manuscript and for publication. And then the part 3, the columns are still flowing, or like still flushed away solutions, and we're hoping to keep them running for a little bit longer. And then this is the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions the audience may have.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I just would like a little bit more information about, I don't know if it's a proprietary process that creates the glass, but what are the waste products of that process, and how are they mitigated?
So I think the company has they have a scrubber. So if there's a more arsenic-3 come from the glass, and then it will go back to the scrubber and go back to the initial feeding source. So it's kind of like a recycle back to and to produce more glass.
Thank you for that.
And in terms of what has to go into making the glass, besides the arsenic trioxide dust, similar to the other presentation, like you have to bring up a whole lot of dangerous chemicals to Yellowknife to do that.
So what kind of chemicals would you need to bring up to do this? Yeah.
Maybe Dave can help about that question.
So the principal chemicals.
I'll get you to just a little closer to the microphone.
Principal chemicals you need to produce the arsenical glass are silicate. So just an industrial silicate, and plus some manganese and iron. So there's nothing that's really terribly hazardous in what they're using. There's potential to try and get the silicate component from processing, tailings, the silicate portion of tailings that are here. But that hasn't moved very far. So, but it's not horrible stuff. It's just stuff that you have to carry. So,
is that helpful? Yeah. Okay. And silicate being sand, yeah. Okay.
Chloe for Cabin Radio. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but are there ideas as to where the glass could potentially be stored at this point? I've heard that it's quite a lot bigger than the arsenic itself.
I think for now it has not been discussed, but from what we've seen is that maybe put the glass back underground may not be a good choice, but it may change if like the formulation changed, or like if it becomes more stable, but we cannot speak for that.
So okay, just want to add anything or no? So the volume pieces would have to be sort of, there's obviously, yeah, how much volume is created, not little cups. Yeah. Okay. I think there was a question here, and then I'll come to you. Okay, Kevin?
Yeah, I guess I had a kind of a similar kind of question. Like, this looks like this is requiring perpetual care. And that's, that's one of the goals, is to move away from the forever care. This doesn't sound like we're going down that path.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. And might invite if there's anybody else who'd like to weigh in. But like the way I'm reading the results right now in the POR study that sort of emulates a long time of exposure. If you look at the amount of arsenic being released under water, various kinds of water, it's much lower than the license limit. So what I'm seeing is it's releasing some arsenic, but it's
It's the same as what's coming out of the water treatment
It's what's
plant.
coming out of the system now. It's many, 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 many times more stable than the arsenic trioxide below ground. Even when you expose it to crazy acidity levels and heat, it's still way more stable than the arsenic trioxide. So it's actually looking to me like a pretty favorable walk-away solution. And the other pieces to add to it is these test samples were done by this company out in Quebec a couple years ago, and since then they have commercialized the product, as we said, in other locations. So they've got even more data on how to make the glass even more robust, including instead of making little pellets, making blocks. They're also proposing to cool it more slowly. So as they bake it and make it, instead of cooling it naturally to slow the cooling down, it's called annealing. So it makes the glass with less fractures in it, less openings for water to get in there. So they've got since then a whole bunch more ideas to turn it from good to even better.
Okay, I'm going to go to the back. I see you, Ken, but did you want to add to that? Okay, and then I'll come to you, Kevin.
Just to add to Mark's response there, another aspect of the vitrification is it does generally turn the arsenic into a less toxic or virtually non-toxic form of arsenic. So if arsenic leaches from that, it comes out as elemental arsenic, which we also don't want to drink. But if the glass breaks up into small pieces or into finer particles, then those would be far less toxic, orders of magnitude less toxic than the arsenic trioxide.
Thank you, Ken. Sorry. Okay. And after this question, we will move on to the next presentation.
Sorry, I've got two questions. Okay, so let's start with the first one. I'm just trying to visualize like what quantity of glass is going to be created by mixing the arsenic trioxide with the glass. Like, as I understand it, there's about 10.5 times the size of the Precambrian building where the movie theater is of arsenic trioxide. That's what's stored underground now. So how much glass would we end up with if we went down this road? I'm just curious. And then one other, I'll push it and ask one more if I can.
So with the formulation they're looking at now, you'd end up with about 4 times the volume. So about, it would increase substantially. It's not, it's for Precambrian buildings, I guess, it's what you'd end up with. But this is early days in developing the formulation, so this is where we're starting.
Yeah, okay, no, thanks very much for that. So I'm just trying to understand, how is the arsenic kind of like locked up inside this stuff? Is it like within the crystalline structure of the glass somehow, and is it actually like chemically transformed? It sounds like it is chemically transformed into some other kind of arsenic. Maybe you could explain that a little bit better for me, or try. Thanks.
So what we found is that so the arsenic in the glass is being transferred into less toxic forms. We have data, we have collected samples, but we just need time to look at the data before we really go too deep what it really means. But from the picture that I showed earlier, maybe it was not showing because
maybe.
Yeah.
Show it again?
Yeah, sorry. I just going to show a few OP. Fun. Sorry. Maybe I'll just go back. Okay. So I think maybe you missed this part. So what we take this slide microscopic slides, and then we kind of like analyze where arsenic is. So the red is arsenic, and then the blue is background. So arsenic is kind of like everywhere on the glass. Sorry, the red is glass, blue is background, and arsenic is everywhere on the glass. And we've also done other analysis, which indicate that the glass itself is amorphous. But we need to look more deep into what we have to actually understand how the glass are bound to arsenic are bound to other molecules. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So just mindful of time, thanks everyone for staying with me there. We may have a few more minutes at the end to come back to some of these presentations, but for now, we will move on to project number 6, and that will be, pardon me, with Nicholas Beyer, thank you very much, Associate Professor at the University of Alberta, and he's going to talk to us about trapping arsenic dust in a cement paste that could be stored underground. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-researcher Isabelle Demers from University de Quebec and Abitibi-Témiscamingue. And this project is an example that Alberta and Quebec can work together successfully. And so we have a PhD student in Quebec working on the project and soon to start a master's. She's taking courses right now, so the project will be moving to U of A for the second phase. All right, so I'll explain what is cemented, well, maybe I should say the title. So we're looking at trapping arsenic dust in a cemented paste backfill. So what is cemented paste backfill? We'll talk about that briefly and why we might want to include the arsenic dust in that cemented paste backfill. Look at why, how do we know if it's a good mixture? So CPB is a acronym that you might see in the industry. It's often used in other mining operations. We'll talk about some of the findings that we have and some of the upcoming work. So what is cemented paste backfill? So it's an operation or a process that's used often at other mining operations. We take our tailings, slurry form, add maybe a little bit of water to it, and we mix cement within it. And we mix that all up to create a paste, and we let that harden with time. And it creates, we see a sample there. It's like the consistency of a stiff soil. So it's not like the cement sidewalk that you might have walked on to get here. This is like a stiff soil. And so that sample is about the size of this coffee cup. And if you take your thumbnail, you could probably just indent your thumbnail, maybe a little bit of your thumb into it. So it's not hardened like concrete, stiff material. And so why is cemented paste backfill used? As I mentioned, it's often used in mining operations. So they might use it for ground support. So it's fairly stiff, has some strength. And so we can backfill voids and stopes and whatnot in the mining operations. And it's being used currently at Giant Mine, I believe, for that purpose. Operations have used it to store tailings in a more permanent manner, as well as to stabilize contaminants within that cemented matrix. And so why include arsenic dust in this cemented paste backfill? So we're hoping that the arsenic atoms can become trapped into that solid structure of that cemented mass and make them less mobile or less available to be dissolved into the water. So the electron microscope image on the right there, it's at 10 micrometers, so about twice the scale that Matt had shown earlier. And we see there's this mineral calcium silicate hydrate forms, and that's when water mixes with cement. And so that's the major binding phase, or like the glue that holds all of this cemented paste backfill together. So we're hoping that the arsenic will be trapped within that binding phase, but it's not a typical ingredient, the arsenic dust in paste backfill. So we're not sure how it's going to behave. So when we mix the tailings, the water, the cement, and the dust, our goal is to create a cemented paste backfill that has sufficient strength and captures that dust within that glue. So we want to look at different mixtures to find that optimal recipe. and under what conditions can we get it to cure or harden to get that strongest material that might be that would also permanently store the arsenic underground. So we received samples of tailings from the Giant Mine site, as well as dust samples, and we mixed a number of different recipes or blends together. I think it was a few hundred samples that our PhD student Amir looked at.
I noticed you have a KitchenAid.
Yeah, they work really well. Industrial strength. Yeah. So all our PhD students are good chefs after they go through the lab. So we mixed a few hundred different recipes, mixtures, blends of tailings, the dust, cement and water contents. We pour them into molds about this size, and we let them cure under special temperature and humidity conditions for different amounts of time. And so how do we know if we made a good batch of this cemented paste backfill? Well, one of the tests we can do is look at the strength of these little cylinders. So we take that little sample after 7 days or a month or 6 months, and we put it in a machine that compresses the sample. So we apply a really large load to it, squeeze the sample till it breaks, and we measure what that peak, the maximum strength that it can support. And so stronger samples would indicate that there's more of that cement binding byproduct created after we added the water and the cement in there. So that could lead to better stabilization of the arsenic. Amir also looked at the chemical stability. So similar to the other projects we saw, we did different types of leaching tests. We did different types of microscopy and some other advanced tools, the synchrotron source, to try and figure out how the arsenic is interacting with the cement binding materials and how well it's trapping the arsenic. And so one of the tests that's common or that's sometimes used in cemented paste backfill is a little leaching test. We have our sample in that container with water, and it's constantly being stirred, and we're monitoring how much arsenic is going into that solution. And so a good mixture will hold the sample together and have low concentrations. Some of the mixtures that didn't have high strength, they just fell apart. So we know that that's not a recipe we want to use. So Amir, through his hundreds of tests that he's conducted on the different recipes, we found what we think is an ideal recipe, or what are the best recipe under the conditions we tested. We have 10% dust by mass in the tailings, about 6% cement, and about 76% solids content for the tailings. Amir conducted some seepage tests, looking at how fast water might move through this material. So consistency of a stiff soil, it has a seepage rate that water flows through it similar to like you might find in a compacted clay in a landfill. So water moves through it very slowly. And some of the preliminary chemistry results, we found that we see the arsenic atoms are combined partly with the cement and tailings, making it less mobile. But Amir's task that he has to finish the next 6 months is to really dive into that chemistry, those details, and untangle what's going on so that we can answer some of those questions about how mobile is it, and is it going to be a more permanent solution, or is there going to be ongoing treatment that might be needed if we go with that approach. So he's about 80% complete. Hopefully within the next 6 months, he'll have his project wrapped up. He's published a journal paper and a couple conference papers, and again, these are freely available to download. And I think we'll make sure the QR code or links are available for those that are interested. And so the second phase of the project is, now that Amir, we found what we think is the best recipe or blend of the different components. Let's see how that curing or hardening phase might be impacted by temperature conditions or potential for it to freeze and thaw, which may impact its strength or its ability to hold on to those arsenic atoms. And so deep storage, the bottom of the stopes, it's going to be much colder than it is in the lab conditions, and that could slow down some of the reactions, the hydration reactions. And if it's stored anywhere near the surface or near the stopes that might be frozen, that could expose the tailings, this paste, to freeze. Or near surface, it might cycle seasonally, freezing and thawing. And so those processes could impact the mechanical strength, the structure, and the chemical stability. So there is a little bit of water left in the pores. of the cemented paste backfill. And as we know, when water freezes, it expands. Probably left a pop can in your vehicle overnight and found it the next morning and there's pop all over. Same thing happens possibly in the pores of this paste. If we allow it to freeze it, it might get micro cracks. And that may impact how water flows through or the ability for the arsenic to escape from the samples. And so Caroline was working with Amir in the summer. We made a bunch of samples, and she's curing these under different temperatures and putting them through freeze-thaw cycles and evaluating the strength. And this summer, when she's finished her classes, she'll start working on understanding how water moves through the samples and some of the chemistry. And we're also at the U of A, we have computed tomography or CT scanner, and we can actually look at the internal structure and see if we can identify some of those micro cracks that may develop within the sample. And this is an example of a cemented soil. This is a natural soil, but one of my colleagues at U of A is using that instrument to see how freezing and thawing can impact fractures and cracks and voids that might develop. So we'll utilize that to help us understand how water might move through or how it might be flow faster if we have fractures that develop. And so she just started in the fall, and she's got about 2 years to the completion of her project. So Amir Hossein is our PhD student at UCAT. Caroline is the master's at U of A. We had summer students working on it and other colleagues at UCAT. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we can take questions on the paste backfill project. Okay, none. Oh, you have to show me.
Is there paste backfill that's needed right now, or is this just a way of dealing with the arsenic trioxide?
There's ongoing operations, I believe, right now to put cemented paste backfill into to stabilize the different stopes and workings underground. So it's not a new technology for the mine site, and it's used at other mines quite a bit all around the world.
But I think that this research isn't targeted at meeting a current need, right? Yeah. It's like a potential way to, is that correct? It wasn't kind of...
Yeah, and the really special part, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is nobody adds arsenic to the cement paste backfill. So here we're adding that new element, and it's doing some weird stuff. And we're, he's perfecting the recipe to make it look like just the real stuff.
Thank you. Okay. Oh gosh, I just whacked myself. I must be getting tired. All right. Well, so now what we're going to do is we'll move to a final, like a final piece, which is actually not about so much doing something with the arsenic trioxide dust, but actually figuring out how to follow what it's doing better, if that's a way to say it. So that we'll finish up with that. And then I would say that after that, people who want to go back to any of these items, we can also talk a bit more about how they all connect or what this kind of really means. So we can open the floor to those questions after. But we'll turn it over to David Blows. And he is a professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Waterloo. You've heard that one a couple of times. And he's going to talk about monitoring arsenic pollution using a stable isotope analysis of antimony. And that'll kind of harken back to the very first presentation, which is antimony and arsenic kind of go together, right?
This is really focused on a new technique for monitoring the behavior of arsenic. Thank you. People keep doing this to me. Monitoring the behavior of arsenic as it goes through the giant mine site. And this is really work that's being done by Kevin White, who's a PhD student that's working with us at the University of Waterloo. And Kevin is online, so hopefully we'll get some responses from him to questions later on. So as we've heard before, arsenic and antimony are occurring together at the giant mine. Both in the ore and also in the arsenic trioxide dust in the wastewater and in the tailings. They're both very toxic. They have low drinking water limits. To actually quite similar limits. And the concentrations at Giant sometimes are more than 100 times higher than those water quality guidelines. As Matt said earlier, arsenic and antimony are closely tied on the periodic table, and they behave in a similar way. So we're hoping by looking at the behavior of antimony, we can understand more about the behavior of arsenic. And the way that we want to do that is by looking at the isotopes. So if you harken back to your high school days, atoms are composed of 3 subatomic particles. There's protons, which are positively charged, and electrons, which are neutrally charged. And in between the protons electrons that are neutrally charged, and in between the protons are neutrons that kind of keep the atom from coming apart because of repulsion between the protons. Arsenic has one isotope with a mass of 75. Antimony has a mass of 121 and 123. But the 51 protons in both the 121 and 123 are what defines it being its antimony as opposed to another element. So we can look at these small differences between the two masses and how those change as chemical transformations occur or as water carrying arsenic moves through the flow system. Unfortunately, arsenic has only one isotope, so we can't do this with arsenic. So we see changes in the relative abundance of isotopes in antimony as a result of what's called the kinetic isotope effect, and that just means that the lighter isotope moves a little faster than the heavier isotope, and it's a small difference, but it's big enough that we can measure it. And then after things have come to kind of equilibrium, there's a slight difference between 2 different compounds that are in contact, and we can measure both of those, or see the effects of both of those things. So how would antimony isotope measurements be useful at Giant? We hope that we'll be able to identify the sources of antimony and through that the sources of arsenic. Maybe we can identify the reactions that are controlling the concentrations of arsenic and antimony, such as sulfide precipitation or reactions during vitrification. And they can help us understand potentially what's going on in the laboratory experiments that we're conducting now. So at about the same time as we started this project, 2 other groups, one in France and one in China, started looking at the same thing. The group in China has made good progress, and they're looking at antimony isotopes at a mine in China, and they've been able to use isotopes to identify sources of antimony pollution and also processes that are affecting the migration of antimony. So it's we think we're onto something here. Our first step or first objective is to develop the method for measuring antimony isotopes at the Giant mine. Because of the water chemistry at Giant with high concentrations of arsenic and sulfate, we can't just employ a technique off the shelf, so we're refining that technique now. And then we're collecting samples from different locations at the mine site to look at how antimony changes as it goes through the mine site and how that affects arsenic as well. So I might have another. Yep. So we're looking at in the surface water system, the polishing pond, Baker Creek, the Baker Creek exposure point, Baker Creek, and then finally Yellowknife Bay. And in the groundwater system, the mill roaster complex, the mill pond, the calcine pond, and the foreshore tailings area. Our second objective is source tracking. So looking at those field samples. So where are there differences in antimony isotopes and locations in different types of samples at Giant, and can these help identify the sources and movement? And then process tracking, when we look at our laboratory experiments, we identify the mechanisms that are occurring in these experiments and how those are affecting antimony isotopes. So in terms of method development, we're doing sample collection, purification. So we have to purify the antimony, get everything else out of the water, and then we can do the analysis on an instrument that's in our labs, and then look at how those concentrations are isotope concentrations are changing. So we're looking at 3 locations, 3 types of samples. So from a tailings impoundment in the northwest containment area, where the water from the underground is pumped up. Then the surface water monitoring system. So we have samples going from Trapper Lake southward through the property and ending up in Yellowknife Bay. And then groundwater samples that we're collecting from wells that were installed by the remediation project team. And so we're able to collect samples from those places. We look at the surface water flow system. We see low concentrations upstream in the Trapper Creek and Baker Creek flow system, then very high concentrations downstream of at the North Water or the Northwest Tailings Containment Area, where the groundwater from the mine water from deep in the mine is being pumped up. And this is the polishing pond after water treatment, and the concentrations decline until we get to Yellowknife Bay. In the groundwater flow system, we're collecting samples along the flow system, and we see low concentrations in areas that are away from the mill complex. But when we're in the mill complex, in the mill pond area, we see high concentrations of arsenic and lower concentrations of antimony. In the calcine pond area, we see high concentrations of antimony and lower concentrations of arsenic. And next, we'll start looking at samples that are being collected from the stabilization experiments, and we'll try and see if we can identify changes in isotope ratios that are associated with those processes, so we can, in the future, look back and see if we can identify those processes from the isotope ratio changes. So in summary, there's a complex history of water and water management at Giant. There's spatial differences in the water chemistry. The arsenic and antimony concentrations are closely linked, so we think by measuring the antimony isotopes, we'll get a good understanding of what's going on with arsenic. And we see similar linkages in the experiments where we're looking at forming arsenical glass or putting arsenic into glass. In terms of analysis of antimony isotopes, we were trying to use that to track the sources and movement of arsenic through the mine site, and then to better understand the potential for arsenic and antimony release from the stabilized arsenic dust. In terms of completion, we're about 25% complete with the project. We're in the process of refining the analytical procedure. We've been collecting water samples from the Giant site, and we'll do those analyses and the interpretations in the future. And we have the same sponsors as everyone else has been mentioning, but a lot of people have contributed to the project, and we're grateful to their help. Thanks.
One of the things that I was wondering about is I think it was Matt's present because I was here today. They went through these as well during the day. The whole difference between and why sometimes it's antimony, sometimes you're looking at that, sometimes it's arsenic trioxide, and how that's different in different chambers. I'm just wondering, you kind of went over it really quite quickly today because we suggested you should be quick. But I wonder if in terms of understanding why antimony keeps coming up, you could go over that again, because I know for me that was something I had never understood. So I'd just like to suggest that.
Sure. Yeah, I can give it a shot. So the ore that was originally mined it was variable. So sometimes there was lots of arsenic, and sometimes there was and very little antimony, and sometimes there was still a fair bit of arsenic, but a lot more antimony. And so as the mine was processing that ore and then generating the arsenic trioxide as a byproduct, when they were processing ore that had more of the metal antimony in it, more of it would end up in the arsenic dust. And so it really is a function of the ore that was being processed. And I know there's a little more to it than that Ken Hall was telling us about, but in general, the final product is reflecting what's going through the mill, what's being processed, and that's a function of the ore that was in the ground that was being mined at the time.
Okay, and so we can open it up for questions around, both the final presentation, but any other kind of overarching or kind of a summative kind of questions around the research at this point. Well, thank you for being here.
I actually don't have a question. I'm just really happy to hear all these presentations and the research that's being done. We've been worried about it, and it's great that you guys are doing this work. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this point, are you actually proceeding with the freezing of the arsenic?
Yeah, so just a bit of context. So there's the government of Canada and GMOB and the project team, and they manage the site. And their solution that they have licenses for is to freeze it in place. They've been busy building pads that then they can put these thermosiphons that will actively start freezing. And so they're planning to do that imminently. They've certainly been doing a lot of the construction to prepare for it.
Right. So how long? What's the time frame to have that all done?
To have it frozen?
Yeah.
I'm really venturing into not my business here, but let me take a crack at it. So the way I understand it, the project is preventing water from coming into contact with the arsenic trioxide by keeping the water level really, really low, much lower than those chambers, using pumps. And then they treat the water. So it's, you might argue, stable now, but I think their extra insurance using this frozen approach is to even prevent even more water from coming into contact by completely freezing it. And that's the next step that they're working on over the next couple of years now. When it'll be actually a complete frozen cube, I'm not sure. Does anybody know the answer is here?
But the water is continually refilling all these cavities down there, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, on that one graph, you could see the water level was like halfway.
Oh.
And it's not reaching the arsenic chambers. They keep it bumped below that.
But it's always going to be filling in again.
Yeah, I think without the freezing and without pumping, water would continue to come in. With the pumping, it prevents that. If the pumps completely fails, what I hear is it would take up to a year for the water to come close to the closest chamber where the arsenic is stored.
Okay.
And then when the freezing will be totally in place, I hear 2038 or something like that. Okay. And that would be the extra insurance, I think, for preventing water from coming into contact.
But the pumping will go on forever.
That's the current
Yeah. That's the perpetuity part.
Right. And that's the new water treatment plant would continue to treat that water. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, thank you. Oh.
Thanks. This is a question for GMOB. Out of the stabilization solutions that we're looking at, that we heard about tonight, are there some that are emerging as more promising?
Yeah, who's the winner?
We're actually going to take a vote before.
Yeah.
Really.
There's a secret vote and balloting system after this. You decide, yeah. So I'll say a couple things that's sort of circling around the answer to your question. None of the projects here you've seen have shown 100% complete yet. And they're all at different stages. Like I think we went from 10% to 80%. So the ideas haven't been all tested fully. That's point number one. So let's wait till they do that. The second one, I think everyone would probably agree with me that the amount of change since the labs reopened post-COVID from one year to another is mind-boggling. We had cement that wouldn't stick together and was dissolving last year. We didn't have a source really of bacteria that might help with reagents for the sulfidation last year. Tom had to just about double the temperature and the times to dissolve products before, which multiplies the cost of a solution. He didn't have that. Like last year, it was a completely different picture. Everybody had a completely different picture on how advanced the research was even a year ago. So, I think waiting for this to be complete will really change the picture. So that's the research part, like what looks promising at the research side, but what is the best solution to be implemented at site is a completely different question, because you've got all these solutions talk about a different product that needs to be stored in an optimally different way, whether it's below ground or above ground. They all have different reagents that can be made at site or being shipped. They all have different manufacturing processes, and they'll all have different costs. And those big engineering questions we haven't even broached yet. And those questions of ultimately, well, first of all, what's palatable to all of us here as a solution? What's the most cost effective? What's the solution that requires the least amount of maintenance? Certainly our goal is walk away and no maintenance, but so all these big questions have yet to be answered. Long answer to say we don't have a winner just yet.
And is it fair to say, Mark, that it may not be one winner? It could be a mixture of
That's actually
things,
a
right?
very good point. A lot of these solutions could work together to, one solution might clean it to a certain level, another solution might kick in to clean it to the next level. So they could very well work together.
Hello. What we're doing is here. That shutter we felt yesterday, that the ground moved and all that. Is there a plan B if there's a big crack in the thingamajigger there, and there's a big plume of dust or whatever goes in the water? Is there a plan B? Because we felt the shutter with my son. My son was saying, like, what'll happen to a giant mine? He's only 9. He asked me that. Any answers?
Yeah, it's Mark with GMOB. It's a really important question of how stable the site is right now under different scenarios like earthquakes or any other big events that could happen from climate change. I'd have a really hard time to answer that question. I don't operate the site, and none of us do here. We're sort of working on a much smaller portion of coming up with what the permanent solution might look like. Ultimately, what we're working on is a solution that would be really stable under all conditions, like essentially making it the arsenic inert or the closest to. So, ideally, we're working towards a solution that even in a catastrophic event, it would be stable and not dissolve in water.
Thank you.
This must be not the only mine that's closed down that has this arsenic problem. Is there any any following what's going on in other places with other mines with this problem, and to learn from that rather than just doing it all on our own?
Yes, and we're testing ideas that others have created from other sites. We're really there's nothing here that starts from scratch. These concepts, small subset of ideas we're testing here were examined in 2000 by Canada when they came up with options. We looked at it again in 2017. We looked at about 50 of these options, and what we're narrowing down is the ones that certainly look to be the most promising, most viable. But all of these things have been done elsewhere, all over the world, really.
Is there a follow-up to that, or that's okay? It's good. Anyone else?
Ms. Mark again with John. If I could add something else, because it's a very good question that you're asking. What's unique about this situation, or makes it particularly difficult, is that the stabilization that we're proposing is done after the fact. So you handle the ore, you process it, and many other more modern sites, they stabilize it on the conveyor belt as they're treating it. So as the arsenic trioxide comes out, they treat it right away and stabilize it. what happened here is different. So a lot of the arsenic trioxide waste was put below ground where workers, you don't want to send people up there to dig the 237,000 tons back up and process. So that's what's really unique is it's down there and it's hard to access. All these projects have been working on a little bit of sample of arsenic that was gotten many years ago, and the project it now needs to get us a new sample. So we got 700 kilograms. It took a lot of dollars and a lot of months to get that arsenic out. It's complicated to get it down below ground. So that's what's very unique about this project is it's down far for us to access, and that's different.
Okay. Probably have time for maybe one more question. It's about 9:22. I'm sure everyone's dying to get their election results. It's kind of like the box scores. People could be calling out the score of the game. Okay. Oh, okay. So you will be the man who closes out the last question.
In terms of perpetual care, are any of these projects eliminating perpetual care at the mine site? Will they? Or do we know? Do we have enough information at this point to say, yeah, we'll be able to shut down the water treatment plant and not have to use that?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, with GMOB.
I think it's the $1 million question. It's a good one to close with, isn't it?
Very elegant question, very well posed, and a heck of a tough one to answer. I could tell you all of the researchers here, when they're testing and design the programs that they did, was with the goal of walking away. They're still in the middle of testing, like what comes out of these stable products. Is it, totally clean water? It's got some arsenic, but is it good enough? Those questions are still out there. But buried in your question, so we're doing the testing of how to encapsulate or transform and make it safer. But buried in your question is extracting the dust, and how much of the extraction is enough where you can stop treating the water. So, extracting 95% of that dust. I mean, there's pieces of timber in there, there's waste metal. So you got to get all that dust out and treat it. So 95% sounds pretty good, getting 95% of the dust out, but is that enough? Or do you still have arsenic cycling through the site and contaminating where you still need that water treatment plant? Or do you need to go to 99%, or do you need to go 99.9%? And the costs increase the more you try to scrape the walls and get it all off. So it's a complex question. At the end of the day, this next step of getting into the engineering and cost will start dealing with these trade-offs, if you will. But for sure, our goal is a walk-away, stable solution.
Okay. So ending with the question that everything begins with. So that probably is quite elegant, as you said. I'm going to note that it is 9:23. I did want to give an opportunity to either the researchers or the Giant Mine Oversight Board to say any kind of final comments, having heard what people were raising, the kinds of questions they were asking, and then I would let folks leave. The researchers and the directors are not leaving immediately if you want to check in with them or have a final question, but I want to let folks go at that point. So I don't know, are there either any of the directors want to add anything based on what they heard? Or otherwise, I'll turn it to the front table here. No. Okay, well. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I think this has been very informative for me anyways. What are some of the concerns and questions that as a researcher I should be thinking about and telling my students to be thinking about as we're doing these projects? Like, perpetual care? Are we making sure we're taking the right measurements to help answer that type of a question, which is important? Sometimes we get stuck in the science and we're so excited about little changes, but what does that mean in the big picture? Does that actually make a significant change or not? So thank you very much.
Anyone else? Alana?
I just want to appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about this project because I'm still in the early stage of my career. I just feel so fascinated about dealing with a real problem and everyone try to work together and try to get a better solution. I'm kind of proud I'm part of the team. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, well, now everyone's going to say like her. Yeah. See.
So we're proud of you, Chick. And I want to thank you for your attention and for coming out. It's good to hear your questions and to put things in a better context for us. So thanks very much.
Oh, well, now you're going to have to.
Lots of pressure now. I just wanted to add that please feel free to reach out to us if you have questions or if you're looking for some of the material that we've been producing. We're happy to share it. And if there is anything that you're unable to track down, the Giant Mine Oversight Board can help with that. And if they can't, you can reach out to us directly. We're easy to find online through the universities.
It's not a command performance, but you're welcome to add.
I'll just say that I'm not at the early stage of my career, but it's still exciting to work with this. So thanks for your attention. It's been good.
I think it'll speak for all the other students. There's co-op students and other graduate students, and they're really, really proud to be working on this. So great.
Thank you, Carol. I wanted to, I'm going to, Mark, you can close us out for the evening, but I do want to ask you to mention how much money has been leveraged, because you mentioned that today, and I think it's a really good news thing that folks in the community should know.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the research program has been going on for many years at this point. We get a budget, GMOB gets a budget from Canada, and a portion of that budget goes to us doing the watchdog business and meeting with you folks and communities, and a portion of it goes to research. And I think over the last 5 years or so, our contribution for GMOB, to pay for all of this project have been in the order of about $1 million. But what's really interesting with working with these scientists is, you saw those logos on the presentation. They partner with a ton more people, and they apply for funding through other sources. Then they multiply these dollars at least 3 more times. So the amount of work that we can do together by working together is really much more than we can do by ourselves. Yeah. And then, in closing, I think we actually ended up hitting a lot of sort of what we've done here today. It was a bit of a whirlwind of learning about arsenic trioxide and what we could do about it. And I've talked already about the next steps. We need to finish these projects in the next couple of years. We've done massive amount of progress. So we expect to be able to submit recommendations to the project in units of measure that would probably be in years, not in decades, not in 100 years. Like, this is moving forward in very promising ways. We're excited about that. Next step is really the detailed engineering to put wheels under all this. That starts to move from research to something that belongs with the project, the owner of the file. So I don't have a timeline for that, but that's where it's going next. I'll echo what folks have said. Thank you so much for your questions, your very thoughtful questions. Talk about this with your neighbors, with your kids, with your family, and come back to us with what they think about some of these ideas or any other ideas. Mr. Ben Nind. Yeah, would you stand up, Mr. Nind? He's our executive director at GMOB. He's the storefront here at downtown, and he does love interacting with Yellowknifers and others.